Hi, good evening. I'm so tremendously pleased to be here, and I want to start by thanking Professor Majumdar for the invitation to join this class's ongoing conversation about the global life of English. So this is a subject I care a lot about, both as your professor said, as the American-born child of Indian parents who grew up to be and were raised to be more British than the Brits, as the saying goes, and also as a newly minted English professor myself. So about a year ago, I finished a PhD at UC Berkeley, and I was hired as an assistant professor of something called Global Anglophone Literature. In other words, I was hired to teach English literature of the non-West, which is kind of an impossible category, an impossibly vast category, but also a category that is only thinkable, right, only possible because of the history of the British Empire and more recent American neo-imperial adventures. So in fact, I think it's probably fair to say that I was hired to teach post-colonial literature, but specifically by another name, right, the global Anglophone. And so consequently, one of my present concerns and one of the things that I want to talk to you about today and talk with you about is identifying in what ways categories like the global Anglophone and like global English, which is one of your class's objects, in what ways they might carry traces of that old thing called the post-colonial scholarship, post-colonial paradigms, and tools. So as you know, I've titled my kind of more formal remarks today, Salman Rushdie, Chetan Bhagat and the Call Center, New India and World Literature. And I'll come back to Rushdie, Bhagat and the Call Center, but I want to just talk first briefly about my subtitle. So the category of world literature deserves many lectures on its own, and you've probably already been talking about it. Here I want to say only that world literature is both a description of past and present literary exchange, right, and a description of existent literary exchange, and also an aspirational horizon, bless you. It's also both an opaque, perhaps overly ambitious category, and an attempt to offer an ethical literary response to neoliberal globalization. In the United States Academy, world literature has increasingly replaced the post-colonial as a category of analysis, and at the same time, it continues to uphold the post-colonial text as the exemplary world literary text. So as readers of Indian Anglophone literature, and I think all of you who have read any Indian literature in English, who consider yourselves readers of Indian Anglophone literature, we might want to ask ourselves some questions, especially when we get to a figure like Bhagat, about whether or not a text, or about what constitutes the world literary text, whether a text is an example of world literature if it's written in English but it's only read in India. Is it world literature if it's written in English but it's about India? Is there a way in which Indian English novels by writers like Chetan Bhagat are actually novels in translation? And if so, what might they be translating? My other subtitular term is New India. And Professor Majumdar already said that, as an Indian American, I have probably maybe a slightly different relationship to the kind of mythic New India that maybe some of you might laugh about. But maybe some of you also recognize New India as the country in which you reside. I mean, maybe you recognize it as a country that has contradictorily enabled the emergence of a liberal arts university like Ashoka on the one hand, and at the same time has led to the various crackdowns on free speech and civil liberties that we've seen on various other campuses throughout India. Or some of you might hear in the phrase New India some of the nationalist fervor and fantasy of the old BJP India Shining campaign slogan. Or you might even think about the tourism board's Incredible India. But for our purposes this evening, I want to think about New India as a discourse, and we can use the less academic jargon, right, and think about New India through a set of overlapping narratives, events, images, and ideas about this global India that has supposedly emerged in the past 3 decades, in particular after the market reforms of the early 1990s. And this is a story that I would imagine many of you grew up with, right? The story of the decline of the West and the rise of the rest, the story about the emergence of India's sleeping elephant economy, the story of the emergence of an Indian dream that is even more poignant than the American dream once was, and certainly no longer is, at least from my vantage. Definitely the New India story is one that marked my own, shall we say, transcontinental coming of age as an NRI who, again, as we were saying, kind of made annual return pilgrimages to an India that increasingly, and over the years, and certainly in my lifetime, has been less and less interested in diasporic Indians, right? And it seems to require and desire us less and less. So unsurprisingly, these transformations in understandings of Indian globality have also changed the terms on which Indian writing in English is being studied. And of course, and part of what I'm going to be talking about a little is my experience of how Indian Anglophone literature is being studied in the American Academy, which is where I'm now teaching and where I was educated. So one dominant story in sort of literary studies in the American Academy is that the globalization of India has enabled a triumphant return to the nation. So after decades of India and its English language writers having been oriented toward the West, right, especially the UK and the United States, now finally Indian literature is returning to rooted national subjects, returning to vernacular languages and concerns, moving away from the elitism of an Anglo-American literary establishment that has for too many decades been focused on diasporic writers. Now supposedly the story is that we are returning to the real India. Right? That's one narrative. And this is the context in which a novel like Aravind Adiga's 2008 The White Tiger became something like the canonical New India novel. Those of you who have read it will remember that he literally has his NRI character, Mr. Ashok, killed off on the side of the road. This is also the context in which someone like the banker-turned-novelist Amish Tripathi has said, and I think this is quotes from 2011, that people frankly don't care for stories of the British Raj or the struggles of NRIs, because after a century, India is rich again, and people want to hear stories about themselves, about our call center generation, right? And what I'm describing here is one narrative. I think it's, at least from my vantage, a dominant narrative that is being offered to describe the shift from a post-colonial to a global framework. And what I want to do this evening and with all of you is to put some pressure on that narrative. So in order to do that, I'm going to draw our attention to two figures who I think are really central to the New India discourse. And that's the expatriate writer, the writer who left India, the iconic figure being someone like Salman Rushdie, and the call center agent, who I think more than the reality TV star, more than the Bollywood aspirant, more than the IT worker, more than the liberal arts student, or any other participant in the project of New Indian self-making, has emerged as kind of the paradigmatic global Indian. I can't tell you how many American anthropologists and sociologists and geographers and communication studies scholars are writing monographs about the call center. I think this in itself is sort of worth pausing over. Why a call center agent? In fact, I will suggest that the call center agent became sort of the exemplary global Indian subject because of her continuity with, as opposed to her disruption of earlier forms of Indian global subjectivity. And I also want to suggest by paying attention to the continuity between figures like Rushdie and Bhagat, or between figures like the expatriate writer and the call center agent, we can better understand some of the ways in which Indian Anglophone literature is currently being produced and read and studied, including, I think, the popular and critical rise of a writer as iconic as Chetan Bhagat, who's now being studied in a number of American universities, and at least as of I read it and reported in April in Delhi University, certainly not in Professor Majumdar's class yet, but is increasingly, I think, an object of academic study. And I want us to think a little bit about why that might be, and to what end, at what cost, enabling what, and so forth. So in my recent work, and in some of the work I've been doing from the States, I've been trying to think about what it means to read Global India in English, and what it might mean to write English as a global Indian. And in pursuing these questions, I've read literary fiction and pulp fiction, ethnographies, journalism, works of sociology, anthropology, a range of visual media sites. And I've found, and some of you may have observed this as well, that there's this particular scene of encounter that repeats across both fictional and non-fictional genres of Indian Anglophone prose. And this is the scene of encounter between repatriated expatriate writers from the UK and the US and call center agents. It's a scene of encounter between novelists, journalists, and scholars who return to India from diaspora and the call center agents to whom they turn in order to apprehend the new India. Is anyone familiar with this? Does this sound like something you've read? I'll give you two examples, and there are actually a number of others. So for example, writer Siddhartha Dev's award-winning work of journalism, The Beautiful and the Damned, begins with the story of Dev going back to India from New York to write an undercover report on the call center. And this is in 2004. Now at the time, the call center is considered the back room of the global economy. And what he finds is that the call center is a fraught and ambivalent sight in all the ways that I'm going to discuss. But he also finds that he and his CV are actually too global for him to be received as an aspiring call center agent, right? He's there supposedly to do an undercover report for The Guardian, but he can't get a job. He can't get hired by the call center. And he writes, in order to become globalized through the call center, I had to stop being globalized and become a provincial Indian. So he's already an accomplished Anglophone journalist and novelist, but Dev has to learn how to speak a new language, and that's call center English. And there's a very similar story that opens an American sociologist, A. Anish's book called Neutral Accent. In that work, Anish, again, goes back to India, and he makes an attempt to get a job as a voice and accent trader at the Dadis call center in Gurgaon. Now, he's lived and worked in the United States for over a decade, so he's confident of his experiential credentials. And yet, like Dev, Anish swiftly finds that he's actually too Western for the job. The call center manager, Pyle, asks him to stop using an American accent and start using a neutral accent instead. So she offers her own spoken English as a model. And when Anish protests that Pyle's Indian English is not exactly plain and neutral, she responds, no, Indian English is global English because it's neither American nor British. And there are a number of other stories like this. And I think both Dev and Anish's encounters in the call center begin to illustrate some telling inversions of the provincial and the global, the diasporic and the national that I'm interested in thinking with you about. In both cases, life lived in the US proves to be a disqualifying experience when the goal is the inhabitants of the subject position of global tech support. As Dev notes, it's the provincial Indian, not the diaspora returned cosmopolitan, who has purchased a new Indian aspiration in the global moment. And as Anish discovers, the call center is not in the business of neutralizing Indian voices into American or British or even transatlantic approximates, but rather in the business of producing Indian voices as themselves distinctly and audibly global. So there's a way in which, in these scenes, the Indian-American diasporic subject, Dev and Anish, emerge as totally unfit for the global Indian. Right? We might say they're late to the new India party. But I also want to suggest that in scenes like this, the repatriated expatriate writer, right? And I'm thinking about journalists, novelists, ethnographers, all as writers. The repatriated expatriate writer emerges as fundamental to the apprehension of global India. Or to put a finer point on it, I think the global new India, right, whatever that might be, emerges most clearly through such scenes of recognition, misrecognition, and reversal. As Dev, Anish, and the call center agents attempt to speak what is nominally, but not actually the same English language across class, caste, and other demographic barriers. And I want to pause on this point for a second and sort of emphasize it, because I think for too long, and again, I won't punctuate every sentence by saying, at least in the American Academy where I'm currently situated, but you can maybe affix that, especially where it's necessary. I think we've been too focused focus on relations between the East and the West, between India and the West. So, for instance, focus very much on something like the relationship between Salman Rushdie and his readers in Britain or America. Or even the question of whether or not Modi is addressing the United Nations in Hindi or English, right? This is a kind of East-West relation question. But I think equally significant and rather overlooked to my mind are what we might call kind of like East-East relations between cosmopolitan and provincial Indians, or Indian nationals and Indian diasporans, whose very relations, I think, actually trouble those categories. And that's something I want us to think about together. Okay, so I want to look at two images that you might have seen before. Certainly, I think Professor Majumdar has seen at least one of them before. Now, these are each what we might call iconic representations of a form of Indian Anglophonism, right? On the surface, they're pretty different. The first, in the corner, is a picture of primarily expatriate Indian writers who work in high literary English, including Salman Rushdie, there in the middle, smiling for a photographer whose gaze stands in for the adulation of English language readers around the world. Has anybody seen this picture before? Okay, I'll tell you more about it in a second. The second image is of global English-speaking call center agents who are also addressing an English-speaking population in the West, but one that is full of grievances and complaints. Now, the first image depicts elite, urban cosmopolitans who participate in what we can call global literary culture. The second features subjects who are probably upwardly mobile in class terms, but whose migratory itineraries are purely virtual. Right? So these are subjects who only ever leave India telephonically, if we can understand them to be leaving India at all. So they're global, to paraphrase the scholar Simon Vikandi, but they are not yet quite cosmopolitan. Now, by that same token, I think these images represent, on the one hand, different forms of what we could call economic and social mobility, but they're also much more closely related than they might appear at first blush. And what I'm interested in is how this juxtaposition might enable us to re-see each of these figures in turn. I'm interested in how a post-colonial literary discourse, because these characters up here, who I'll talk about more in a second, these are the classic post-colonial writers taught, at least again in the American Academy, Rushdie, Ghosh, we'll talk about them. I'm interested in how the discourse that has animated the study of their writing, a discourse that is totally inflected by tensions around diaspora, tensions around whether or not English can capture Indian realities, how might that help us to understand something like the transnational interconnection associated with globalization, and then vice versa? So, for example, ethnographers of the call center have described call center agents as things like phone clones and dead ringers, in this very classic language that recalls the Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul's mimic men. And for those of you who have some Homi Baba, you'll be able to think about the ways in which a similar discourse on mimicry inheres in those kinds of phrases. The call center agents have also been described as cyber coolies, which is a kind of ironic kind of name. They are now these sort of cyber coolie speaking subjects who, for a number of scholars, have come to stand in for the silent subaltern, at least the silent subaltern in the way that we used to read that figure through Gayatri Spivak. Okay, let me say more about everything I just said. I'm going to say everything I just said, but again, in a slightly different way that may be more intelligible. So I want to look at this first image, which was published in a 1997 issue of the New Yorker magazine with a somewhat ironic caption, "A gathering of India's leading novelists." And if I'm standing, by the way, blocking somebody's view, please just shout at me. So why was this caption ironic? It was ironic because the photo was taken in London, and all but one of the writers had flown in from outside India, from Amsterdam, Vienna, Boston, New York, in order to take this picture. And the majority pictures, Amit Chowdhury, Anita Desai, Amitav Ghosh, Rohinton Mistry, and of course Salman Rushdie, they were at the time expatriates living outside of India. So how could they be India's leading novelists? Now in the past 2 decades, this specific image, we're still moving, okay. This specific image of primarily expatriate writers and the special issue on Indian fiction in which it was published have been widely discussed as epitomizing the problem of Indian Anglophone literature's historic over-determination by its reception in the West. So when literary scholars talk about the obsession with diaspora in Indian literary studies, they're most of the time pointing literally to this image. This is a much discussed image. Now in the same issue, suddenly I sound very loud, right? In the same issue, this 1997 issue, Salman Rushdie made a very, at least in some quarters, famous pronouncement. He wrote an essay saying that the prose writing created by Indian writers working in English is proving to be a stronger and more important body of work than most of what has been produced in the so-called vernacular languages. He said Indo-Anglian literature represents perhaps the most valuable contribution India has yet made to the world of books. Anybody read this essay from 97? It's this like famously chauvinistic declaration that was, of course, he was taken to task for. And there's a lot to be said about the statement, and a lot of people have written about it before. I think, I want to note briefly that, of course, Rushdie's ideas about English's exceptionality relative to the Indian vernacular languages keys onto certain somewhat tired ideas about English's relative neutrality in India. So, of course, there's the old saying about when urban, educated Indians meet anywhere in India, they first speak in English. I don't know how much that's true anymore. You'll have to tell me. I'm not sure that it is. I'm often confronted with people who speak to me in Hindi, and my Hindi is so bad that I'm embarrassed and look like a fool. So maybe that's not true. But there is, of course, this idea that English has a kind of neutrality and is able to mediate between North and South, East and West in a way that no other language is. But Rushdie's essay also garnered attention, in no small part, because of the global and international iconicity of Salman Rushdie himself, who for the last 2 decades of the 20th century was India's most celebrated literary figure on the international stage, right? At least as far as prizes are concerned. He's the booker of the bookers, and so forth. He's the writer who, with Midnight's Children and Satanic Verses, supposedly made a hybridized, chutnified, mixed-up Indian English a form of what the American literary scholar Rebecca Lofowitz would call cosmopolitan style. But for our purposes, and given what Professor Majumdar's students have been talking about recently, I want to underscore that Rushdie's polemic was also an entrant into the fraught language debate in post-colonial literary studies. So I think the sides of this debate can be shorthanded with reference to 2 African writers who I believe many of you have recently read, Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And the side that one takes in the Achebe versus Ngugi debate hinges on the answer to one question. Can a language like English, or for that matter French, that's a colonial bequest, be grafted onto the national body of a formerly colonized people? So answering in the affirmative, yes, a colonial language can be indigenized in a formerly colonized space, are those like Achebe, who in 1965 at least seemed to concede that the national literature of a country like his Nigeria would inevitably have to be written in English, and that, moreover, English would be able to carry what he called the weight of African experience. On the other side is the Kenyan writer Ngugi, who famously bid farewell to English in the early 1980s with a vow to write only in Gikuyu and Kiswahili, saying that for an African writer to write in anything but an African language would be to subject himself to alien cultural values. So for Ngugi, as you know, writing in his mother tongue, Gikuyu, was an anti-imperialist act. So to some extent, Rushdie was maybe just agreeing with Achebe, that English had and has become an Indian language, as it is a Nigerian one, as it is an American one, and that it could and can and will continue to carry the weight of Indian experiences. I mean, these are debatable points, I think, but perhaps not inherently offensive ones. To my mind, the trouble with Rushdie's essay was that he chose to sort of double down on the English side of the post-colonial language debate in this magazine issue that was also totally obviously celebrating expatriate writing, thereby conjoining in one sentence the problems of English exceptionalism and the choice to leave India. Right? So kind of joining English exceptionalism to kind of extraterritorialism. Now this question about choice has been central, I think, if not always explicitly, to debates on Indian literature, including the work of all those pictured here. Right? Questions about the choice to write in English, question about the choice to live outside of India. Now, I would suggest that these are not really choices at all, and that a reading of authorial practice and identification in voluntaristic terms is a very misleading way to approach the question of Indian English literature. But this is an issue we can return to with respect to Bhagat, who I think significantly exploits such ideas about choice in his writing and his self-presentation. But first, let's look more closely at the second image, which depicts call center agents at work in Bangalore, and it accompanied a 2011 article called Accent Neutralization and the Crisis of Identity in India's Call Centers. So what do we see? It's a little bit of a glare, but you have call center agents pictured in rows in this geometrically partitioned office space, and looking at their sort of identical cubicles, at the faceless subjects staring into the computer monitors, you can sort of see why some critics have said that the call center is India's version of the Chinese sweatshop. By that same token, we can't actually see what any of these agents is looking at on their computers, and they themselves embody a variety of forms of physical comportment. Right? So some of them are slouching in desk chairs, some of them are leaning forward, they have their heads cocked against headsets, arms folded. A couple agents are walking around, and there's two people conversing in the front who look almost conspiratorial. So it could be that what we are seeing in this image is an entrepreneurial greenhouse for a generation of aspiring global citizens. It could also be that because there are 17 agents pictured, 6 of whom are women, or 35%, in contrast to the New Yorker image, which featured only 25% women, 2 of whom were brand new on the literary scene, that maybe the call center is a progressive outlet in which Indian women can seek opportunity and economic advancement. Of course, that same kind of argument is debated by supposed traditionalists who see something like the call center as an existential threat to supposedly traditional life worlds. Okay, I'm just kind of sketching out here a broad terrain of contradictory arguments about the call center. Has anybody here worked in a call center? Does anybody here know anybody who's worked in a call center? So this is kind of a familiar image, I would imagine, to many of you. By now, I think the call center has become something of a global cliche. Right? It is the literalization of what the geography David Harvey once called time-space compression. Right? So I sit at home in Arizona and I call my bank and I'm connected to tech support in India. So nowadays it's actually the Philippines and Mexico. And I miss the tech support in India because they were the first people who could pronounce our names, which was kind of exciting for us in the US. Okay, now even a brief reading of this image shows the call center is a cliche, but it actually also crystallizes some of the key tensions inherent in globalization and the spread of global English. Because English, as taught and utilized in the outsourcing industry, is what the linguistic anthropologists would call a modular and serviceable language, spoken by service-oriented agents in their modular cubicles. Now, the optimists say that call center English is a vehicle of economic advancement and development, particularly for communities formerly barred access to educational and vocational institutions for English language acquisition. The critics, on the other hand, describe call center English as a coercively mimetic form of American English. In other words, it's something that is not native to India in ways reminiscent of how Ngui conceives of European languages in the African context. So I want to go back to this pair of images. I think despite some of their very visible differences, bless you, or like a plural bless you for the many people who sneezed, despite their visible differences, I think it should be a little more apparent now that they actually capture a set of complementary relations around the questions of identity, location, and voice. So first, the question of identity. Expatriate writers and call center agents are Indian subjects who attempt to speak for India or from India, and in so doing are effectively performing as India's ambassadors outside the territory, rejuvenate those language literatures. And she also stresses that outsiders often use what she calls typically English and largely outmoded literary techniques. So if any of you read this book, you'll know that she's especially disdainful of Vikram Seth, for in her view copying Austen and Dickens. And I'll spare you further analysis of her argument, but undergirding this kind of critique, which I think we find smuggled into various works of world literary scholarship, is the idea that writers like Rushdie or Achebe or Jamaica Kincaid, who I think many of you are going to read soon, that they're fundamentally outsiders to English, right? That their work is derivative of modular English literary forms, and that they're not native speakers. Okay, so what does any of that have to do with Chetan Bhagat? Is that for me? Thank you. Okay, you've heard of Chetan Bhagat, right? Okay, I began my discussion of this expatriate writer call center agent relation with two scenes of encounter with expatriate writers and call center agents. This is recap. Dave and the call center, Anish at the call center, trying to get jobs, being too American to work in the call center. And then we looked at two images of expatriate writers like Rushdie and Ghosh and call center agents in order to think about some of the ways in which the latter figures might be the global incarnation of the older post-colonial figures. So what I want to do now, bless you, and I will say this is totally in a suggestive and not definitive vein, what I want to do now is think a little bit about how this relation might help us understand the rise of Bhagat, rather, to say, put it better, the sort of critical rise of Bhagat, specifically as a writer of global English who rejects affiliation with expatriate writers and has instead proclaimed kinship with figures like the iconic New Indian call center agent. So when I talk about Bhagat abroad, even those who have heard of him don't really know anything about his life. So I tell them some things that you probably already know. I tell them that he is a repatriated expatriate, that he was educated in India, that he then worked for Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, and then he returned to India. I tell them that he has written 7 works of fiction. I call it pulp fiction. I tell them that his work has vastly outsold the better-known literary works by Indian English writers, the ones that they've heard of. I tell them that many of his books have been adapted into popular films that are popular not only in India, but all over the world. And I tell them that he's published lots of 2 essay collections in addition to lots of journalism in both English and Hindi. And I tell them that he likes to tweet. We have some people in the US who also like to tweet, and it's horrifying. And I think it's fair to say that 13 years ago, and some of you were probably too young 13 years ago to remember this, but when 5 Point Summer was published, literary critics in India didn't really take Bhagat seriously. They saw him only as a sociological expression of the fact that English is both quantitatively on the rise in India in terms of number of speakers, and they would say qualitatively on the decline. Or to put differently, they saw him as a sign that the democratization of English has yet again meant the language's bastardization. Right? It's kind of harsh critique, but I think it's worth thinking about. But today, Bhagat has achieved the symbolic heft. I mean, I think this is fair to say. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I think he has achieved or is achieving the symbolic heft in conversations on global Indian literature that only Rushdie had in the post-colonial context. And he has done this by explicitly dismissing earlier generations of Indians writing in English. So he has asked, quote, what is the point of writers who call themselves Indian authors but who have no Indian readers? I want my books next to jeans and bread, he has said. I want my country to read me. And if it is true that for many years the Bhagat novel was primarily marketed and read only in India, today his work is garnering, I think, considerable attention from critics and scholars outside of India, myself included. So, for example, Bhagat has been read and described by the scholar Alka Anjaria as potentially the voice of the new Indian middle class, and as having, quote, leveled the playing field between English and the vernaculars. Another scholar, Manisha Basu, credits Bhagat with being both a public intellectual and a youth icon. For Priya Joshi, another important scholar, Bhagat's work elucidates a new phenomenon and future for the novel in India. Urvashi Bhutalia, who I believe is at the Ashoka now, has also suggested that Bhagat, along with writers like Anurag Mathur, has possibly redefined our notions of what good and bad writing are. We might have to call her in to discuss that with her, I don't know. But, so here's the thing though, and this is, I want to offer this as a kind of critical caution. But because Bhagat writes politics, and because he has been voluble in the public sphere about addressing young India, right, and about representing what young India wants, the risk is that critics and readers abroad will assume that his novels, and they do assume often, that his novels have what the cultural historian Michael Elliott would call an artless accent, right? The assumption is that because his work is produced by an author who doesn't imagine that he's being read outside of India, that therefore, sitting outside of India, we are privy to an authentic conversation happening among and between real Indians. I think that's a kind of critical risk. And I'm more skeptical, as some of you might be as well, about the seeming artlessness of the lowbrow. I don't think this work is artless, right? As well as of Bhagat's disavowal of non-Indian readers. So the question, I think, or a series of questions, I think, that we need to ask are, one, how are we to read Bhagat, right, as scholars? Can he be read closely? What is his relationship to the authors that many of you have been reading in Professor Majumdar's course on the global life of English? And what would it mean if, in fact, Bhagat has leveled the playing field between English and the vernaculars, right, which is one critical claim? What claim would we be making about vernacular literatures, if that was the case? And what claim would we be making about Indian English? Now, for better or worse, Bhagat's novels are part of the machinery of the sort of larger Chetan Bhagat phenomenon, which means that they're not just artifacts of the popular or semi-ethnographic accounts of Indian youth culture, but they're also catalysts for much critical ink spilling on the subject of the new India and the global English in which it is supposedly being written and read. So take, for example, One Night at the Call Center, which I'm going to assume most of you have read. Has anybody not read One Night at the Call Center? Okay. I'll give you the two-sentence summary, which is, so the novel tells the story of a group of call center agents at a call center in Gurgaon, and they have to exploit the fears of their American customers in a quest to save the call center and save their jobs. And there's some love stories, and there's this very interesting deus ex machina, and I won't get into any of that. And the novel is also bookended by what affects to be an autobiographical frame story in which a passenger on a train incites Chetan Bhagat, the author, to tell the story of, quote, the real India. And there are various scenes of suspended agency and various professions of identification throughout the book, through which I think Bhagat produces the call center agent as a kind of surrogate for himself. Right, so he professes this kind of, from the beginning in the frame story and then in the novel, a kind of identification with the protagonist, Shyam, who goes by Sam in the call center. And we can talk more about what that kind of identification looks like and sounds like if you want afterwards. But what I want to talk about a little bit is the language, right? The English language that is in this book. As an example, especially given some of my earlier comments about call center English and what call center English might be, right? How does call center English then appear in a novel? So the conventional argument is that because Bhagat is not talking to Americans or Brits, right, he does not want or need a Western audience, so he does not need to dress up his English in ethnic markers. So those of you who have read this book will remember that you're not reading words like karma, dharma, and shanti, which the novelist Vikram Chandra has used as story titles and then been accused of using to signal Indianness in the West. And there's also no really inventive language play, which is something that Salman Rushdie has been credited with. So there's a passage, for example, in Midnight's Children, a kind of classic Rushdie line, where he discusses what he calls the fortunate ambiguity of transliteration, how the word Buddha is spelled just like Buddha, and so forth. Bhagat doesn't play around like that, right? So what Bhagat is offering in this book is a kind of fantasy, or a writerly and readerly fantasy of call center English, which I want to suggest is actually a far richer object than the novel suggests. In call center English for the in his call center novel, One Night at the Call Center, the English is for the most part kind of stripped down dialogue with little narrative description. So he writes things like, an agent's lipstick is thick as cocoa, and she's voted the, quote, hottest chick at Connections. He says that somebody's irritating mother should be put in jail and made to watch daytime TV all day. One agent says, pass me the next dumb customer. And the other one says, reality sucks. But by contrast, when Siddhartha Dave actually did get a job, finally he does get a job at a call center in order to write his undercover report, the call center English that he learns is what he calls, quote, an idiosyncratic rendition of a Northern Irish accent brought back by the call center trainers from the BT facility in Belfast. And in Anish's telling, you remember the sociologist A. Anish, call center English is actually a highly technical linguistic form that the industry is attempting, however naively, to produce as a form of placeless, neutral, global accent. And he brings back evidence like this, notes, in order to prove just how fraught the decision of how to pronounce a word like laboratory really is, right? Laboratory, laboratory, right? And he works out all these different kinds of pronunciations. And to be fair to Bhagat, there is one moment in the novel where he gestures toward a more complex linguistic landscape. So that's a moment in which Sham, who goes by Sam, laments the difficulty of pronouncing the letter T in an American accent. Some of you might remember this moment. And he says, okay, T can be silent, so internet becomes internet. T and N merge, and when T falls in the middle, water is water. And this moment, I think, sticks out because it's the only moment, or one of the only moments in which Bhagat in that novel seems to think about the English language instead of reducing it to a kind of lowest common denominator. But I'm not interested in dismissing Bhagat as a bad or lazy writer, incapable of capturing the nuances of how India really speaks. Well, I think it's worth thinking again about how his call center English relates to this actual material call center English that people are being taught and trained in. The reason why critics are interested in him is because his novels also seem savvy about the hypocrisies of the new Indian narrative. So One Night at the Call Center might be a pulpy tale about the self-realization of call center agents, but it does offer a critique of the Indian nation state for allowing corporate outsourcing firms to take responsibility for employing Indian youth. And the novel is also, as some of you may remember, self-conscious about the quality of its own prose. So Sham says, quote, my English is not that great. If you're looking for something sophisticated and highbrow, then I suggest you read another book with plenty of long words. He says, I know only one big word, management. And I don't know if this is the case with every, it's loud time again. I don't know if this is the case with every edition of the novel, but it's true that in the first printings, the words and phrases like management, output, optimal solution, and underlying variables were actually bold-faced throughout the text. It was a narrative gimmick, I think, that had the double effect of highlighting the call center boss's jargon and also providing a kind of caution to the reader about the efficacy of this kind of management and self-help idiom. Because those of you who have read the novel will recall that when the call center agents themselves actually attempt to use this kind of language, it backfires and the boss appropriates their work as his own. Okay. There's this story that Bhagat apparently likes to tell. So some of you might have heard it before. About a young woman in Dehradun who asked him at a book reading about his haircut. You heard this story? So apparently she asked him at a book reading about his haircut. And he said she would never have asked that question to Salman Rushdie. She would not even have raised her hand. And in his decade as a new Indian literary icon, Bhagat has numerous times told stories like this, making reference to himself as a kind of anti-Rushdian figure. Right? I'm using Rushdie as a kind of shorthand for a whole series of these expatriate writers that we might also have talked about. He numerous times has said, I'm the writer who is approachable, that the average Indian can talk to me about my haircut. They would never have talked to Rushdie because, he said, he's the one who actually has Indian readers. He's the one who identifies with the call center agent, right? Not with the Indian Anglophone writer. I think the preceding discussion will probably have made clear that I view these pronouncements and the literature which shores them up, as in large part capitalizing on the new India discourse and critical desires for a national literature that can once and for all disentangle itself from expatriate writers oriented towards the West. But I think that there's another lesson that we should extract from the rise of Bhagat and his increasing centrality to conversations on the new Indian literature, and that has to do with this relationship between expatriate writers and call center agents that I've been talking about. And the fact that India's global legibility continues to depend on the audibility of its textual and telephonic voices. So today I was focusing for the most part on Bhagat's celebrants, who read him as India's first mass-oriented English writer. But of course he also has many detractors, those who see him as further evidence of how the English language has, quote, ruined Indian literature. So for example, in a much circulated New York Times op-ed in 2015, the novelist Atish Tharoor argued that Bhagat writes books of such poor literary quality that no one outside of India can be expected to read them. He said, "This is not the voice of a confident country. It sounds rather like a country whose painful relationship with language has left it voiceless." Now, by calling Bhagat and his readers voiceless Indians, Tharoor both denigrated colloquial forms of English and of Indian English, and then he reasserts the value of Western-sanctioned literary bona fides in their place, right? So he's concerned that nobody outside India is reading someone like Bhagat. But the irony is that Western-sanctioned literary bona fides are precisely what expatriate writers of the Indian Anglophone novel have always been criticized for. So in another kind of well-known work, Babu Fictions, the critic Tabish Kher specifically lamented that the success of novelists like Rushdie, or for that matter Naipaul, has been measured on the hard fact of their sale all around the Eurocentric world, largely based on the so-called literary quality of their writing. Poor literary quality, so-called literary quality, too literary, not literary enough. What I'm trying to gesture towards is what we might think of as a kind of zero-sum game in Indian Anglophone literature. I think this is a moment, a very interesting moment, in which it seems clearer than ever that both highbrow and lowbrow texts, both literary and functional forms of Indian English, both provincial and global subjects, right now I have all of these terms in quotes, both the nation and the diaspora, are equally subject to dominant ideologies around questions of nativity and vernacularity. And this is the problem on which I want to sort of close and then open up the discussion, which is the fact that the integrity of Indian English, whether the cosmopolitan silence of someone like Rushdie or the supposedly neutral accented global English of the call center agent, all of these forms of English and their Indianness have been secured through specific linguistic performances of difference that I think we need to think about. It might be that the work of the Anglophone novel in its current phase is precisely to register the fraught global life of English in India. I don't know if we're going to talk about that too much in a few weeks. But part of what the Indian Anglophone novel is doing, I think, is registering the fraught global life of English. But in any case, before we dispense with the expatriate writer like Rushdie, and before we assume that we have moved on from the paradigms of the post-colonial, and I think equally before we celebrate Chetan Bhagat's supposed return to the nation, we do need to continue to ask again who, what, and where we are returning from. So that is my prepared kind of opening salvo, and now I would love to hear from you.